now, before our discussion round will start, the comment from Professor Dr. Marta Hailu will proceed. And yeah, she's an assistant professor at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, and currently also holds a guest professorship at the chair of Professor Dr. Tietje. Yeah, her research mainly focuses on international investment law, international trade and sustainability issues, and on regional economic integration law, with a particular emphasis on African regionalism. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all the presenters for a very wonderful presentation that you've made. I'm not that much conversant with the EU law, so maybe my question may not be that much deep, and all of the issues that I would raise would be basically to have a good understanding for myself. So let me begin with Cornelia. It's a very interesting paper. I've tried to see like the approach that you have seen in terms of the multilateralism with regionalism impact and so on. My first impression was like both you and Robert were presenting that the Ten-Bay agreement, or yeah, I don't know whether I should call it agreement, is being somehow refuted by the domestic law of the US, whereas the EU is continuing implementation through different legislation. So what is the relevance of continuing this the implementation process within the EU, while that is not the case with respect to the US. Another point that you mentioned about the MFN clause in your paper is introducing reciprocity in MFN. This has been done in one of the agreements in Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Area. It introduced this reciprocal kind of MFA. Then we bring it to the WTO, and then we have the US and the EU, who are the largest partners, trading partners in the world, and then they have this reciprocal MFN. Can we say that there is a sort of an action on the part of the states, a sort of structural shift on, or what is the relevance in terms of forming Customary International? Do we have the practice being put in place by the majority of trading nations and under the WTO? And then when you looked at the free trade agreements, which the European Union was concluding, or is concluding currently with different trade partners, specifically with regard to the TSD chapters. Yes, it's the name since 2021, you said assertive, sustainable kind of thing, the motto. But then there's a difference when it comes to, developed countries, and the agreement is with a developing country. So sort of, you've also mentioned it a couple of times in your presentation that it's going to be sort of an agreement with like-minded nations. So can we say that this assertive sustainability model that was designed was structurally flawed from the very beginning, because it's not working with every country? And then again, on the India FTA 1, what do you think would be the systematic risk? Like, it excluded the TSD as all from the FTA agreement. So what would happen? Like next time when the EU is negotiating with an African country, would it be used as a precedent or by another developing country? So what do you, just to get your reflection on that. On the EU-Mercosur agreement, partnership agreement, you are referring to the essential element, being in the Paris Agreement in good faith, remaining there, and so on. I was just wondering, what would be the legal solution that the EU will have if a Mercosur member state fails to meet its nationally determined contribution obligation under the Paris Agreement? Probably the last and a more of a broader question would be, you've said that it's time to change the motto. If you are given the opportunity to, to design the new motto for the EU, what would it be? And for Robert, I'm very much impressed with your paper. I find it very informative. I learned a lot from your paper. Thank you very much. But again, I have probably two questions for you. One is the one I've already mentioned in terms of the legal realism, the legality versus realism on the ground. And then I was also considering, like, in terms of coming up with a sort of a counter-argument. Both of you are mentioning Article 24 not being observed by the Turnberry Agreement. Can we think of a different way of looking at the issue, meaning the US capping the tariff 15% and with having what do you call it, stacking, no stacking, and 15%. So it's like you have a sort of a managed standstill. Is there any way we can replace the requirements under argue to replace the requirements under the substantial all trade requirement the tariff liberalization argument under Article 24, that we're not, there's no increase, there's no stacking of tariff, so we're dealing with a managed standstill in regard to the tariff. So it's just a thought, one. And the other one is on the temporal scope of Article 21. When do you think should a state or the EU raise a security concern, national state? Should it really be in war? Because it seems that what the justification from the EU side, I understand, is we need to get the future security. But how future? Like today in the afternoon could also be future. Isn't it that kind of scenario that we had? So that's my question for you. And Obi, I have a couple of questions. One on the methodology. You said that in your paper it says that you're using qualitative doctrinal approach. I was just wondering, how are you going to prove constitutional transformation using a qualitative doctrinal approach, if you just reflect on that. And the other is on the Brussels effect paradox. You seem to view that these strict laws would be accepted by everyone, and it will lead to unification, a sort of similar laws being adopted across the globe. But if what is proposed by the EU is very rigid, overly rigid, the impact would be that businesses would stop would stop doing business with the EU. They would be decoupled with the European market. Because I'm saying that from some couple of years ago, I was involved in a research on the EUDR impact on Ethiopian businesses. The EUDR, it has also sustainability provision or requirement there. We were also looking into the CS3Ds. And then the replies that we were getting from the businesses were, they are nowhere ready to comply with what was required back then. So many of them were saying that, well, we'll go somewhere else. The major product was coffee, and almost 30% of the coffee exported from Ethiopia comes to Europe, and majority of it is here in Germany. So the company's responses, the producers, the farm holders' responses was that the requirement, one, it doesn't take into account the reality on the ground in poor countries where farmland is somehow a small kind of thing. So they were saying that we'll export our products to new markets, to Asian markets, because coffee is getting somehow recognition and consumption amount was rising in the Asian countries. So that means the companies will pull out from the EU market, then that means what's the point? Instead of that, wouldn't having a sort of a flexible, less stringent rules would help to realize the Brussels effect, actually. The other one is on the transformational and informational distinction that you're trying to make in the paper. The fact that the previous one requires too much information, they have to declare those informations. But like in terms of making the companies to focus on their internal organization to make them more strong, wouldn't it be better to have small information disclosure requirement so that they can focus on that instead of just checking, a box of, I have complied with this, I complied with that. So I feel like there was some kind of contradiction in your argument when you were criticizing the new the omnibus legislation in respect of the transformational and informational perspective. And then my last question is, you are saying the omnibus legislation is it's a sort of, it raises a legitimacy concern. I think it's also shared by Robert. It's a sort, but you're specifically saying that it raises a legitimacy concern, so it's going to be an inherent risk or inherent threat to the rule of law. But again, where do we draw the line between the legislation being efficient for businesses and being a sort of an illegitimate or an illegal way of deliberative tool? These are my questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martha. Is there already a first question?
Thank you. Wolfgang Weisch, Bayer University. I particularly address the presentation by Robert Richter. There were some ideas or questions which I have in mind, more a comment maybe, which first of all, it's very interesting. Yeah, what do we do with the implementation of the temporary deal by the EU legislator? We know it's apparently WTO non-compliant, so one would easily say, okay, then it cannot further exist as a EU legislative instrument that does not comply with EU constitutional law. Well, we have to look closer to this. First of all, procedurally, yes, I don't know whether you have come across that. There's a new EU institutional agreement between Commission and European Parliament, which also has a very brief sentence that the EU the Parliament's rights of being informed before negotiation starts on non-binding instruments apply also in the same way as to binding instruments. This is a new, I think it's paragraph 31 now, which did not exist in the previous version. So it would be interesting to see whether this has been followed this time. I don't know. I don't know whether the Commission had informed the Parliament. Well, actually, one was aware that Trump and the EU Commission will do something there in Scotland. Yeah, it was somehow in the books that this could happen. Well, but now closer to the EU constitutional legal aspect. Of course, we have this obligation of strict compliance with international law. But the European Court of Justice makes a little bit of an exemption when it comes to EU autonomy. And part of the EU autonomy is the full and free function of the EU legislative. And we have now a legislative acts where one could say, well, this is an issue of external trade, and we have different objectives in EU external action. So maybe the legislative in the EU is in a good position to balance different aims and objectives, to see WTO compliance is just one of that. It has to be balanced maybe against other issues of, well, security, defense. So that could offer a leeway out of this, or a loophole out of this dilemma that we, on the other one hand, say we have to respect international law. On the other hand, the legislative act does not do that to the fullest extent, but the Court of Justice might find a way out of that problem. Yeah, that's my idea on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, would you like to answer? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comment. I have no doubt that the ECJ will find a way out of this dilemma, and not the way that I proposed. They are very creative in that regard, but the question I want to pose is that really in the sense of the spirit of the treaties? And I would say if we have the strict observance to international law, I understand that the ECJ cannot do its own interpretation of international law, the WTO appellate body or the panels have the say on that, but if we have really a regulation that is so clearly not in compliance with WTO law, I think there's a real tension here between this regulation and the text of the treaty. And I would say then at least modify the treaty to exclude the strict compliance to international law, because otherwise we have I think this would lose its meaning. And therefore I would say that I understand, and I'm sure that there is an argumentative way out of that, but I don't think that is that really resolves the tension that we have here. In other cases, I would agree that there is, of course, often compliance with international law, WTO law and other international law can be disputed in many ways, and you can argue about it. So, and of course that different interpretations can be considered by the ECJ, and should probably also say that it's possible that it is legal, and therefore we will not declare this act as illegal. But if it's, I think here we really have a case where it's very clearly not in compliance, and I think this tension is a real issue, and I just basically wanted to highlight that this is a kind of also a new issue, I would say, because I don't, or at least I don't recall that there has been such a clear violation without any attempt of plausible justification of WTO law. As I just have the microphone, I would address also the comments made by Marta. You mentioned the legality versus realism and the question whether all of this even matters if the US imposes new tariffs. And of course, I totally agree. This whole thing might be suspended immediately if the US imposes new tariffs, and then could be suspended. I mean, the Article 3 of the final regulation text includes quite broad language on which this regulation can be suspended again, or the commitments made by the EU can be suspended. And I think it's very much possible that it will. Of course, we never know what happens in the US. It's so unpredictable. So I think the sign or the intention behind this is really to show goodwill and to show that the EU is willing at least to honor the commitments it has made under the Turnberry deal. Whether this means anything to the US, I mean, who knows? It might not. Then on your point that the commitment of not having tariff stacking is a liberalization in itself. If I understood that correctly, you mean that because the US says we will not stack the tariffs rate, we have a liberalization, and therefore we could argue that it is a liberalization of substantially all the trade. I think it's an interesting thought, but I would still say raising a tariff to call that a liberalization is really stretching this beyond the meaning of the word, I would say. Therefore, I think it's interesting, but and I have not thought about it before, but I think it's unlikely that this would really fall within this requirement. And finally, on the security concern, which might be a future security concern, well, Article 21 clearly says in times of an essentially emergency in international relations. So this really limits the scope just from the text of having a future emergency. I think in times of is a very clear indicator that you cannot justify future emergencies here. I think it's also another argument why Article 21 cannot justify this beyond the ones that I've already mentioned, because if you were to construct an emergency in international relations between, let's say, the EU and any other country, then it would have to be in the future, right? So this really doesn't work, and I think future concerns just the text of the agreement just limits the scope here. Maybe if you also to the.
Yeah. So thanks for the comments. They are indeed very pertinent. Some of them I addressed them in the paper. Some you just gave me a food for thought. So first of all, the Turnberry deal has not been completely refuted by the U.S., but there has been certain indication that it might happen in the future. But as well as with your question, with respect to your question, in case of the FTA TSD and the systemic implication of potential other agreements following the same approach, this is also the case here. So regardless of the fate of the Turnberry deal, it sets a precedent. So I think it actually invites others to engage in similar conduct. It invites others to invoke potentially Article 21 because there is an emergency in international law. So it clearly represents a systemic risk. Not to say that it's only illegal, it also clearly indicates that the EU is willing to renounce, as I said, some of its value, be it sustainability or multilateralism. Introducing reciprocity in MFN and whether that's a structural shift and whether it could be perceived as new practice. Even if some might try to interpret it as a new practice, the purpose of tying MFN to reciprocity is clearly aimed as to counter actions of big economic powers like China. And while we have countries like the US and EU clearly wanting to change the MFN, of course, on the other side, we have China, potentially other countries, Brazil, India, smaller developing countries that do not want to tie MFN to reciprocity. The argument being that the EU, US, they have increasingly opened their markets and others have not done so. And of course, that other parties do not want to do so. And as I already said, for subsequent practice under international law, there should be at least agreement, even if not explicit consent, at least acceptance that this is the agreed practice, which is clearly not the case. Whether the developed approach followed in FTA's TSD differs and whether it was initially flawed, I think initially the purpose was especially to provide an assertive enforcement approach in case of FTA with developing countries, because with countries that are all developed and already have in place certain mechanisms that ensure that they effectively protect, for example, climate, they don't really need this mechanism. So the mechanisms that are there were especially designed for countries that could deviate from their Paris commitments, for example. And we see that the EU simply backtracked. So the question, I think, it's rather what is the value in including this mechanism in countries that anyway follow their commitments? So potentially it was initially flawed, but the intention, I think, was to follow with a unique approach towards all partners. Of course, the context changed completely, and the EU now is looking towards forming new partnerships like India or Mercosur countries in the wake of the geopolitical tensions with the US. Whether there will be any means to actually make partners, FTA partners, follow their commitments under the Paris Agreement, as for example in case of the Mercosur Agreement, that if it doesn't have an essential elements clause. Well, I don't think there are right now, although there could be arguments under general international law to argue that it still was an essential element. The EU, even now, would try to argue that the agreement as it stands also could be interpreted as covering in implementation, because it says good faith, and it could also be good faith not only to the remaining a party, but might also mean that just remaining a party without implementing is not in good faith. So there could be a space for a broader interpretation, but this interpretation is clearly not supported by the other party. With respect to a new motto, I do think that it does not reflect the current reality. I do not support many of these initiatives, but if I were the Commission, I would frame the new motto maybe in terms of economic security, since it tries to argue and justify that it's for the sake of security, and something about forming new partnerships. But it definitely is not something that I back. But if I were the Commission, I would do so. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Martha, for the comments. So I'm going to respond or answering the comments that you give. So about the methodology, I'm using actually doctrinal legal analysis when I'm using empirical from Sabin Center from the Columbia Law University, where I'm proving how the climate litigation actually improving the trend emissions that maybe I put in the paper. The second one is about the omnibus one. I just really want to clarify. It's not. This is not like a suggestion. It's actually already legislated and implemented 3 months ago. Actually, it's newly. So I understand some of you are unaware about this. And about the third one, about the competitiveness awareness, when you say that if Europe cannot relax the regulation, we will go somewhere in Asia. I think we can go back to the theory of race to the bottom, where everyone competes, but in the end, everyone destroys to each other. And this is the problem, actually, when we think benefits over people and planet. And this is not about, opinion, because we already commit to, to reduce the emissions 1.5 degrees in Paris Agreement. So it's not only like a suggestion, it's a commitment that many states signed, and they commit regarding the technical how to reduce the emission. One of them actually CRD and CSDDD, it's the further effort by Paris Agreement. Before Paris Agreement, actually this haven't got yet. So after the Paris Agreement, they're creating this to increasing the effort to reducing the global warming 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think in the same times, we should believe that sustainability, the protection of our planet is more important, this is my opinion though, over benefits. And I think prosperity over destroying the planet, it's not something that I'm not recommend. And I believe that some of you will agree with that. And also about the flexibility, about simplification. The Omnibus One, actually the language of Omnibus One, it says simplification. But if you read the whole directive, it's actually more than that. The Omnibus deleting or avoiding the mandatory, the climate transition plan. Actually, if I'm a director of the company, I think creating the climate transition plan is not that difficult. It's not that burdensome. But why you don't want to create that is something political tension. Maybe you don't want to commit to make sure that your corporate strategy in line with the climate target, zero net and Paris Agreement. As stated, many countries agree upon 1.5 degrees in 2045. And I think it's more than just flexibility and simplification. There is some, a race to the bottom where everyone want to be rich over each other. And I think the last one is about the internal information that can keep it, like let's say the human rights abuse. I think there is some UN principle guidelines, how about the business should also respect the environment, the business line. So each business should respect these two principles. But how? Like, of course, by disclosing what they do in their sustainability reports. And I think that's the reason why CSDD and CSRD trying to push this company. You have to put all information regarding your business activities and what do you do to prevent the climate harm and the human rights. Unfortunately, the omnibus one trying to reducing this obligation of sustainability law. So it's just more than simplification. I think if just like paperwork, it's probably fine. I mean, it's true, like less paperwork would be good by business, but if more than that, like reducing the strengthening of sustainability law by erasing or like deleting the climate transition plans, the value change obligation regarding the partner business, I think it's not that difficult. I think even before the omnibus one, many companies are already creating this and no problem at all. But they want more. They want more like by deleting this obligation. And I don't think it's in line with our target, our commitment to reduce the global warming at 1.5 degrees in 2045. I think that's my response. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You have a question.
So thank you all for your presentations. This was very interesting and educational for me. I have a comment for Robert, and then I have a question for you, Cornelia. So as to my comment, I thought it was very interesting to see now somebody come at the EU and sort of the Court of Justice in terms of compatibility review from the World Trade Organization side, because I've in the past looked at that from the environmental sphere, particularly as a question of the Aarhus Convention and the EU's compliance with that convention. And there, what you find is that the compliance committee of that international agreement has for years held that the EU is not complying with the obligations under that convention. And the EU has taken twists and turns to kind of try and argue that, hey, actually it's fine and we can't influence the case law of the Court of Justice because it's an independent institution. And the Court of Justice has kind of not really cared. And there, really, the very strict conditions for reviewing the compatibility of EU law with international law have hampered greatly any attempt to argue before the court that actually you are not complying with international law. So in that sense, I fully endorse your suggestions for how we should turn the table around, but I also agree with you in that the court will probably not heed. But there, again, we did eventually, through political and other kinds of pressure, get an amendment to the implementing legislation at EU level. So that might be, again, a more viable option and of interest to you. As for my question to Cornelia, I was wondering, now that you mentioned the issue of good faith staying a party in the Paris Agreement and its sort of an interpretation, are you familiar with the advisory opinion on climate change that the International Court of Justice issued? And I was wondering whether your take on or what would be your take on the influence of that advisory opinion in interpreting potentially that clause, should it ever come to it?
So if you refer to the recent opinion and Article 31(3)(c) of the VCLT, Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaty? No?
No, just generally kind of if you were to use the advisory opinion to interpret what good faith means in the context of the
Well, yeah, it could be. I mean, good faith interpretation, when what good faith could mean, it could also be not only from the ICJ perspective. There's also a vast jurisprudence from the WTO perspective how good faith is to be interpreted. For example, good faith has been interpreted in the wake of Article 21, arguing that it means that it's not subject to complete deference to what parties perceive as being a security issue, an emergency in international law. So potentially there could be an interpretation, a broad interpretation of what good faith means in order to cover also the implementation. And we have seen in multiple instances dispute settlement bodies trying to compensate for what is missing in the agreement. And of course that could be the case, but considering the fact that there is only a mechanism that is cooperative in the EU-Mercosur agreement, this means that even if there was a panel of experts, that panel of experts would be an expert from the EU, an expert nominated by the Mercosur country, and a third one. That already lowers the standard. Even if they would were to adopt that panel of experts, a report, that report wouldn't be binding for the parties. It would only have the value of, like a guiding value for the parties to reach a separate agreement. So even if it were, which there is a chance, what would be the actual impact? I would say it's low, but also I think the actual risk is also low for the EU. I mean, that if there would actually be for the chance for the EU to use the mechanism. Of course, it's a different question, but I think the most important aspect is actually the systemic effect. The mere fact that the EU is ready to, in some instances, to simply say that remaining a party in good faith is fine, and in EU-India completely like omitting this part, it simply shows that when analyzed together that this might not be of a primary interest for the EU. Even if in case of the Mercosur, good faith could be interpreted broader. If you look at the broader picture, I don't think it's that important.
Yeah, I don't think I have to answer. It was just a comment, so but I can. I mean, I just would say I agree. But one thing maybe to add is, of course, I'm not that familiar with environmental law and what you mentioned, but of course, it always matters how legalized, let's say, the international law there is, how strict the commitments are. If there are rules that really allow a lot of flexibility, I think there is an argument for not striking them down at the ECJ if they are very vague. But I think here we have WTO law sometimes can also be very vague, but here we really have a case where I would say this does not hold as an argument, just as a quick comment.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I have one question for Cornelia, because just now when you were talking about voluntary agreement under GATT Article 24, you were mentioning that the Tilbury deal may not be voluntary, but surrender or coercion. So I want to know from your perspective, do you think this shows a legal constraint of the European Union, or is EU's unwillingness to act assertively against the US because it's a powerful country? So what's your perspective? I'm very curious to know.
Yeah, first of all, as I said, it's very interesting to see that this expression, voluntary agreement, is only can be found only in Article 24.4, which it's only setting the purpose of the entire Article 24, so it's per se not an obligation. So the question, what is actually the meaning of this expression, is very vague. There is no WTO jurisprudence that would establish this as a separate condition, that there will have to be a voluntary agreement to qualify as an FTA. We could also look into, of course, public international law rules, Vienna Convention rules on the law of treaty, saying that if there is a coercion exercise, that could affect the legality of the treaty itself. But then again, I was wondering if the Vienna Convention on the law of treaty rules apply to the Turnberry deal, since article, if I remember correctly, it's Article 1 that says the scope of coverage of the VCLT, and it does not cover non-binding agreements. But let's suppose that there would be a WTO jurisprudence that would say that voluntary agreement, the expression of Article 24, influences the interpretation of Article 24.5 or 24.8b. And it would be actually an extra additional condition than those already established by the Turkey textiles jurisprudence, an appellate body dispute. In that case, potentially it could show that there was a certain degree of coercion, but then we come to the question whether there was economic coercion or not. I doubt that there would be anyone actually willing to discuss or to somehow interpret in that case. Why I wanted to mention this, it's because it shows that the EU chose the path to defy its commitment to multilateralism and at the same time to backtrack from its promise to act more assertively. Because it could at the same time respect its commitment to multilateralism and also show that it's willing to act more assertively in defending its trade interests against a very powerful state. So the Turnberry deal itself shows that the EU, it's not open nor assertive. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I think we are pretty much perfectly on time. So if there are like no really important questions, I would call it a day actually. Yeah. So thank you very much to our second panel. I think it was a really interesting discussion as well. And thank you for everyone who participated today and engaged in our discussions and so on. Yeah,